Deputy Chairman, Mr. Dr. Tony Tan, guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to GIC's 30th anniversary, which also happens to be my first public function after the general elections. Contrary to what you might think, the coincidence was a coincidence. But polling day was 2 days ago, and the PAP has won the people's mandate for 5 more years in a tough election battle charged with emotions and rhetoric and issues. And now that the hurly-burly is over, we have to come together again and work for the long-term good of Singapore. So it's a good time for us to look ahead and ask ourselves, what's the lay of the land? Globally, Asia, Southeast Asia. And what can Singapore do? What strategies will work for us to deal with the risks and to improve our people's lives? The global environment, I think, if I get the sense of the discussions, is generally on a firmer footing for the moment. Major economies on the slow road to recovery, but there are simmering risks and major longer-term problems not yet tackled, not even with possible solutions clear. America needs to deal with its fiscal deficit. It doesn't lack the resource to solve these problems, but the key is, can the political leaders on both sides get together and convince the American public to accept the pain which is necessary now in order to repair America's economic situation and make sure it is sustainable in the long term. It's a very complicated soundbite to present in any election campaign. And I do not believe this administration is going to tackle it until after the presidential elections next year. The U.S. has had its credit rating put on negative watch. It hasn't affected bond rates so far. But whether or not the rating agencies' views affect the market, the reality of the unsolved problem that this fiscal challenge is looming and growing, that must eventually affect confidence in the economy and the ability of the Americans to continue to finance their debt and ultimately, with international implications, the value of the US dollar. It's a problem for the world. We worry for you, we worry for ourselves, because it's not clear what other currency could become a new anchor for the global economy, or how we can evolve from the US dollar to a radically different global financial order. Our best bet is to move progressively towards a multi-currency world for stability. Even that is complex. Singapore is a small player. We now have a seat at the IMF, where Finance Minister Tharman is chairman of the IMFC. And for this year, we are also participating in the G20 process to discuss these important issues. That's the US. In Europe, there are sovereign debt problems. At the scale of the pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, is not so enormous as to capsize the whole European ship. But these problems will prevent Europe from playing a dynamic role in the world economy. And there will also remain worries about possible contagion to bigger countries in Europe, even though everybody concerned steadfastly denies that this is a worry. The current situation of partial economic union with monetary but not fiscal integration in Europe will always be fraught with troubles. The underlying problem beneath the institutional arrangements is that wages have outstripped productivity growth in the Mediterranean countries since the time when they joined the euro, leading to a large loss of competitiveness of the pigs against Germany and other northern economies. I think Ireland is a slightly different situation, but certainly that's true of the Mediterranean economies. In the short term, you can gloss this over by borrowing and accept the current account imbalances. But that eventually leads to a crisis a debt crisis on the part of the borrowers, and equally important on the other side, anti-symmetrically, a banking crisis on the part of the lenders. The more sustainable approach is further fiscal centralization in the EU and an explicit system of transfers between countries, with strict conditions applied on countries receiving help. But this depends on an overall European political identity emerging, which is the work of decades at least, and hasn't evolved yet, and is not likely to come about in time. The more fundamental economic solution to this is for the uncompetitive economies to carry out deep structural reforms, especially to create competitive labor markets and to reduce fiscal subsidies, and to have economic development, productivity, growth, upgrading through fundamental transformation. The countries are trying hard to achieve this, putting their body politic under huge strain. I spoke to Prime Minister Zapatero recently from Spain, and he told me how the more he listed out the items on the menu for change, the higher Spain's standing rose in the international financial system, and lower he went in the polls. And by the time he completed, he looked at the list and he says, "I've covered every single base, I'm clobbered." But these are the choices which the countries have no choice but to take. And he, as a socialist prime minister, had to do things completely against what he had stood for all his life. So the body politics is under huge strain. We don't see an easy solution, but we hope that Europe will collectively find its way through this very difficult challenge. In Asia, the prospects are positive. China and India are growing strongly, pulling up the entire region, but again with some vulnerabilities. China, in the short term, have avoided a collision with the US because they've allowed greater flexibility in the renminbi exchange rate, in fact, greater appreciation since about the middle of last year. So that's smoothed over the problem. It's also dealing with internal imbalances, serious internal imbalances, inflation, very hot property market, and challenges in the banking system. But for the medium term, it has work to do. It has to rebalance the economy to depend more on consumption and less on export-led growth, which I believe they are focused on doing and totally serious about at all levels. And if you talk to their officials, they are all on message with the same mantra, that they have to stimulate domestic demand, be it through investments, be it through consumption, be it through infrastructure or urbanization. At the same time, they have to manage the rapid urbanization which is taking place and is part of this necessary economic transformation. The urban population is already almost 50% and is expected to surpass 50% this year, and it's increasing by 1 percentage point per year, which means every year there's another 13 million Chinese moving from the rural areas into the cities, needing houses, roads, schools, hospitals, utilities, government, law and order. 13 million people is one city of one London or one New York, and continuing for the next 20, 25 years. It's an enormous challenge for China. Their government is clearly determined to tackle these issues, but it has been much more cautious in managing the political evolution which will be necessary to keep up with the tremendous economic and social changes underway. In India, the growth has been high. We hope the vitality will be sustained. But the pace of reform and liberalization is clearly unlike China's. Not for lack of talent or knowing what to do, but simply in a very complex political situation with many constraints on the government, however well-intentioned and determined. The government is democratically elected, unlike China, which in the long term is a plus, but in the short term makes it very difficult for the administration to focus on reforms and investments. And you can see this in the grossly inadequate infrastructure which limits the capacity of the economy. And the roads, trains, power supply, housing, on all fronts. Areas where China has invested heavily, India is having difficulty getting started, which is going to constrain their productive capacity. Between these two giants, Southeast Asia is overall stable, but facing various local problems. We have short-term inflationary pressures in several economies, worsened by high global food and oil prices. And Singapore is one of those carried along because we are so open. We have security issues between Thailand and Cambodia, for example. There's a border conflict which is hots up and flares up from time to time with exchange of fire and bloodshed, loss of life. It won't escalate into general war or even war between the two countries, but is not good for the participants and is not good for Southeast Asia as a whole, because it sets a certain color on how things are in the whole region. We have an agenda for ASEAN regional economic integration, which is progressing steadily. It's meant to be an ASEAN economic community by 2015, which is 4 years from now. We may not fully achieve this ambitious agenda, but we should make significant progress and give ourselves a more connected and business-friendly region.